I'll write the words and you'll write the music. These simple words said by Oscar Hammerstein to Richard Rodgers in 1942 would forever change the way musical theater would be staged. Rodgers and Hammerstein, spotlighting social conflict through musical theater. Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein were no strangers to conflict while they composed music and lyrics for the American stage from 1943 to 1959. Their goal as composer and lyricist was to spotlight issues of social conflict through musical theater. They refused to compromise their musical statements, thereby raising America's consciousness on topics ranging from racism to domestic violence. Rodgers and Hammerstein would usher in Broadway's golden age of musicals. They developed what we now know as modern musical theater. They built characters and storylines that not only entertained, but caused audiences to think about deeper issues. The writers were now driving the process, and they weren't afraid to address social conflicts. Prior to Rodgers and Hammerstein's success, Broadway was waning in the 1930s. The Great Depression, World War II, and Hollywood all fueled Broadway's downturn. After Rodgers and Hammerstein produced Oklahoma in 1943, nothing would be the same again.
The reason that they were successful at it is that they wrote stories that were incredibly appealing to America at the time.
A starless cast, a new composing duo, an inexperienced director, and an ordinary plot. Before its Broadway opening, critics doomed Oklahoma to failure. No gags, no gals, no chance. Rodgers and Hammerstein proved them all wrong. The story of Oklahoma, based on the 1931 book Green Grow the Lilacs, opened in the Indian Territory town of Claremore in 1906, 7 years before Oklahoma's statehood. This was the age of westward expansion. In Oklahoma, there were conflicts that existed between the free-range cowboys and the land-owning farmers. Neither wanted to compromise to end their land disputes. It was suggested very simply that everyone just needed to get along.
Territory folks should stick together. Territory folks should all be pals. Cowboys dance with the farmers' daughters. Farmers dance with the ranchers' gals.
This fractured territory was trying to become a new state in the Union. Everyone needed to put aside their conflicts in order to unify. When Farmer Laurie married Cowboy Curly, it was viewed as the territory folks all compromising their differences, no longer separated by race or class.
And it kind of gave us encouragement to find compromises and get over our differences with one another. And I think that message spoke to the whole country, actually, ultimately the whole world.
Rodgers and Hammerstein also tackled the conflict of assimilation. By addressing the issue of the outsiders, they wanted to show that assimilation was good. The Persian peddler, Ali Hakim, was seen as a good outsider, one that could make compromises and fit into their community. The threatening farmhand, Judd Fry, was seen as a bad outsider who would never compromise to fit in. After Oklahoma, Hollywood producer Sam Goldwyn posed the question to Rodgers. You know what you should do next? Shoot yourself. Trying to match Oklahoma's success would be difficult, so they decided on a different approach. They tackled the dark conflict of domestic violence. The story of Carousel is based on Molnar's 1909 play, Liliom. It was a depressing story of domestic violence and suicide set in Budapest in 1873. Rodgers and Hammerstein were reluctant at first, but they decided that they could address the conflicts appropriately. They never compromised the original storyline of imperfect people living in an imperfect world. Carousel was the tragic love story of a young mill worker, Julie, and her carnival barker husband, Billy. Domestic violence was not a conflict that people openly discussed, but Julie tried to justify Billy's physical abuse as an act of love, even to her daughter Louise.
But is it possible, Mother, for someone to hit you hard like that? Real loud and hard. And not hurt you at all? It is possible, dear.
Rodgers and Hammerstein then addressed the taboo conflict of suicide. They made a small compromise to have a more uplifting ending by making Billy's death appear accidental instead. In order to be successful with audiences, they knew they needed to have a less depressing ending. Literature professor Philip Beadler asked the question, what kind of people, slightly more than 7 years after Pearl Harbor, could possibly make World War II into a Broadway musical? Of course, Rodgers and Hammerstein could, and they would address the conflict of racial intolerance along with it. Basing their story on James Michener's book, Tales of the South Pacific, their next musical would soon be born. South Pacific debuted in 1949 and was set on a Polynesian island during World War II. 2 love stories were included. The first story was the one of Nellie Forbush, an unsophisticated Navy nurse from Arkansas who fell in love with Emile de Beck, a Frenchman who lived on the island with his 2 Polynesian children. The second story was that of Lieutenant Joe Cable, a young Marine officer who found himself in love with a Tonkinese island girl. Both love stories spotlighted the conflict of racial intolerance. As a Southerner, Nellie always saw people of color as inferior. Cable had this same conflict from his wealthy upbringing. Both rejected their lovers based on race. However, Nellie compromised by finally realizing her love was stronger than hate. Unfortunately, as Cable was starting to realize how superficial racial barriers really were, he was killed.
Got to be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made.
South Pacific was the musical where Hammerstein made the most compromises. The early drafts showed a much more controversial script, even using the derogatory word colored to describe de Beck's children. Hammerstein felt he needed to soften his stance to avoid offending audiences. For the first time, Rodgers and Hammerstein had an overt political message. In prior shows they referenced intolerance, but now South Pacific had 2 love stories that focused on this racial conflict. Rodgers and Hammerstein wouldn't compromise their ethical standards just to make people feel more comfortable. They adamantly refused to remove the carefully taught song from the production. South Pacific didn't back down on the conflicts, but bright colors made them friendly. Rodgers and Hammerstein were able to soften the tone and not the message in this volatile time preceding the Civil Rights Movement. After South Pacific, Rodgers and Hammerstein were asked to create yet another unique musical. The King and I, written in 1951, was based on Margaret Langdon's fictionalized novel, Anna and the King of Siam. It was the story of 19th century Siam, told through the lens of a Westerner. Anna was a British widow who became the tutor for King Mongkut's family. This story of a schoolmarm and a barbarian underlined how Western and Eastern cultures struggled with the conflict of understanding each other. Many conflicts were present in this musical: slavery, beatings, harems, and degradation of women. There is even a play within a play based on the slavery tale of Uncle Tom's Cabin. When the choreographer struggled with the slavery ballet, Rodgers was quoted as saying, "Make it more comic and less tragic." The idea worked and the message was never compromised. Rodgers and Hammerstein also drew attention to the treatment of women. The king had many wives which he treated as lesser people. Anna rejected this Eastern world treatment. She even challenged the king to not beat his runaway wife. The king was finally broken and realized that his culture needed to compromise in order to change. Rodgers and Hammerstein never compromised on how the characters were portrayed. Since this was a show about how racial conflicts disappear once there is understanding, they wanted no Oriental stereotypes. In 1959, Rodgers and Hammerstein began work on writing a new score for The Sound of Music. This musical told the World War II conflict of the Von Trapp family and Hitler's invasion of Austria. The Von Trapp family would not compromise its beliefs by going along with the German takeover. Rodgers and Hammerstein wrote political songs such as No Way to Stop It in the original musical to address how people were not really feeling any conflict about the Nazi invasion.
Be wise, compromise.
Compromise and be wise.
Let them think you're on their side, be non-committal.
Rodgers and Hammerstein's work impacted our country economically, socially, and politically. First, their success helped to revitalize Broadway when the theater district was struggling. Live theater became a popular entertainment venue again, and national touring companies brought quality productions to the country. These 2 musical geniuses raised social awareness of the conflicts of domestic abuse, slavery, and racial intolerance. Their work also impacted the political scene, examining patriotism, World War II, and the rights of women. American musical theater had now become a stage where people could address controversial issues. Rodgers and Hammerstein were no strangers to conflict. Their goal was to spotlight issues of social injustice through musical theater. They refused to compromise their musical statements, thereby raising America's consciousness on all kinds of social conflicts. Richard Rodgers summed it up well when he said, "A song is a lot of things, but first, a song is the voice of its time."